Sheba and I'll be your co-host for tonight. Now I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Selvaraju Murugesan, Head of Data Science at Kowai.co. Selvaraju Murugesan has over a decade of experience driving data science initiatives and AI strategy in both academia and the SaaS industry. And today, he'll be sharing insights on how you can transform your documentation to serve both human readers and AI chatbots seamlessly. With that, I'll hand it over to Selva. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Shiba, and thanks for joining us. And let me get straight into the what we're going to cover in this webinar. We'll be focusing on the RAG for chatbot, just giving you a high-level idea about how this chatbot's been built. So, you know how the technology works, and from technical writer's perspective, can have idea about what's the limitation of this technology and how we can actually refactor your content so that the chatbot can actually understand the content in a more efficient way. Then we'll go into some of the refactoring techniques that we actually discovered over a period of time. And then I'll go into some best practices and then some practical tips to achieve AI-friendly content. So let's dive in. So you've probably seen it. So there is a major shift happening in terms of how customers are actually accessing your documentation. It's no longer where they come through a search engine and then they do some search on your documentation or navigate some table of content to find the content that you've written. And most importantly, they actually spend quality time in reading every little word that you've actually written. And those days are gone, by the way. The people who are avid readers in terms of reading high quality, long content are basically are shifting towards more of a shorter format. Okay, that's a major customer shift we are actually seeing in the market. And you probably seen it. The chatbots are everywhere. Any site you go to, any e-commerce site, any kind of SaaS product company website, the chatbots are everywhere. They actually penetrated to every single aspect of our life. And in fact, people actually think that the chatbot is the user interface for the newer generation of people. Okay, so that's there. But there are few trends that we see in terms of how the knowledge access to the documentation actually evolved. Primarily, when we wrote, we always had human audience in the mind. So we understand the constraints of writing for a human. For example, brevity is a key. They have short attention span, things like that. But right now, we have chatbots as one of our audience, okay, for our documentation, and that's going to happen, and that's going to grow. And the content discovery happens through search engine in old days, but these days it's all chat gpt, perplexity, and cloud. And usually in the SEO world, you optimize for a search for a keyword, but here you got to structure the content such that we do something called GEO, generative engine optimization. Okay, and people love to put prompts in your chatbot or documentation rather than keywords in the old paradigm. And most importantly, given that there is AI agents in place, the AI agents will talk to your chatbot and then probably automate a lot of this task. Okay, so from a technical writer perspective, you have to understand the characteristics of two worlds, writing for humans and writing for AI. So writing for humans involves understanding their characteristics. Basically, humans have shorter attention span, and so brevity is the key. So we always wrote short sentences and we are very precise on what we want to tell. And humans, they instead of reading textual information, they love multimedia artifacts. So that's why we produce animated GIFs. We have images, and you probably know the proverb: "The picture is worth 1,000 words." So we, as a tech creator, we always love to have some kind of screenshot and explain a process in a very animated GIF and things like that, which is very intuitive for humans to actually consume the information in your documentation site. And obviously, we write using inclusive language. Of course, the accessibility is the key for appealing to everybody who is coming to your documentation site. But if you write for AI, it's very different. The AI are text-hungry applications. They, the more text you give, they love it, and they also have conversation. You have to write in a very conversational way, how a human or a chatbot would actually interact with the documentation. And most importantly, the consistency of business terms is extremely important. Of course, it's also important in writing for humans as well. But for chatbot, you have to be extremely careful because it works on semantic matching. So it can sometimes get confused if two words are semantically matching but have different business definition altogether. Okay, you got to be very careful. That's why you got to use business glossaries, or terminologies consistently across your documentation. And of course, yeah, so the chatbots, whenever it's in doubt, it needs rich metadata to actually understand which one you're talking about, or it needs a bit of a context. So so the metadata actually provides that piece of information to help your chatbots to figure out the right context. Okay? And the most important structure I always come to that is the information architecture. Is your information architecture of your documentation site perfect? Okay? So for people who do not know about information architecture, it's a blueprint for your documentation. It tells you what content goes where, and most importantly, how your user navigate your documentation site. And basically, it consists of three blocks. So, organizing the content. So, you probably gone to a lot of this libraries or maybe the old public service offices where you see a stack of files, and usually they are color coded. So that's how they usually organize the piece of information. So the information architecture for documentation is basically about organizing the content, how you want to make sure that your content is easily organized for customers to consume, most importantly understand. And it's all about taxonomy. How do you group things, and how do you make sure that the grouping is making sense to your end user? And of course, each content piece of content you write need to have some kind of a content structure. I've seen many documentation where they start with some kind of structure saying prerequisite, pricing plan, and they go into detailed on particular what or maybe a how to procedure, and then they actually end with some kind of a tip or maybe some kind of a summary about that. Okay, and it is consistently followed across all your not documentation articles. So this actually gives a clarity on to your user on to find what kind of information in what section of that content. Okay, so that's pretty much what this information architecture is about. Information architecture helps everybody. It's just not humans. It also helps the AI to find quick answers. Okay, and it's also helpful in improving your customer experience. Those two, the first two aspects are very much customer or end user oriented, and the third is aspectly for us as a tech writers. We want to make sure that the documentation site is maintainable. So we do a lot of maintenance in terms of reviewing the content, doing a lot of translation as part of DDLC. So it's very important for us to have good information architecture so that the documentation site is maintainable. And the essential components of an information architecture is these four. And again, it's not something new if you are already know about information architecture. You need a table of content, and especially you need a bit of a heading hierarchy in terms of how these things are organized. And wise tech writers, they probably know that you have to write documentation in terms of the user needs, not on your product features. Okay, so that's very important or a key to having a good information architecture. Of course, the search bar has to be there, and you have to logically sequence things in your table of content or the heading hierarchy so that it makes sense to the users to navigate your site. And once you do that, it's easy for a human to do that. But most importantly, for an AI, on the top, you also have to do a lot of semantic structuring, which I'll go in detail in the session 3, which will talk about how do you make it easy for an AI to navigate your documentation site. For a human, it's very simple. You already have it in place, I'm pretty sure. But for an AI to navigate your whole documentation, it's a very different kind of a paradigm, which leads to how chatbots are being actually designed. So before I go into this RAG, which stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, by which most of the chatbots in the current world is being built, you got to understand a few concepts. The first concept is, I'm pretty sure if you are working with AI chatbot, they this term is already thrown out, called tokens. A token is basically a 4 characters, and a word, it's approximately 75 words. So that's usually two terms they actually use chatbot world. And with the RAG architecture, there are two aspects to it. One is called pre-processing, and then after is called retrieval or inference or retrieval. Okay, sorry, the generation part. The first part is retrieval. The second part is more about generation. So before it does the retrieval, you have to understand how the content is being stored for it to retrieve the content. Okay. The essential step is it takes all your knowledge base, excuse me, or documentation article, and they actually do some kind of a pre-processing. Okay. As a tech writer, you have to understand what kind of pre-processing they actually do on your content. They might throw away some of the media artifacts that you have, some hyperlinks, or any kind of JavaScript or CSS that's part of your documentation article, they usually throw it away. And they take that your article content and then they actually split every 500 tokens. Again, it's a rule of thumb. They can also do dynamic chunking and depending upon your chatbot vendor and how they actually implemented chunking. So basically, they take your article and they split the article into smaller chunks. So every 500 tokens, they actually chunk. Okay, very simple. Again, I talked about tokens. 100 token is about 75 words. And once you chunk your content, the next thing you do is there is something called text embeddings. You have to convert that piece of text, the chunked content, into a numerical representation. That is called embeddings. Embedding is a process of converting your text content into numerical vectors, basically. And there are APIs to do that. The famous API is text embedding ADAM 002. And I think OpenAI also have the new model, the small and the large model for text embedding, which are a lot more powerful. And once you chunk your content and create a respective embedding, which is the floating point numerical representation of your content, you basically store that in a vector database. Very simple. And this is very interesting when it comes to the retrieval part. How does it actually, chatbot actually generates a response? So let's say somebody comes to the chatbot and then puts a prompt. So you take the prompt and you send it to OpenAI and you convert it into an embedding. Very simple. Then with that user prompt embedding, you actually scan every single entity in your vector database on what are the chunks that actually matches this. Okay, the term they actually use called cosine similarity. Basically, it's a distance between your two vectors. Okay, that's in a very simple term, and you pick top five. Only the top five vectors that actually matches this user prompts, and respective chunks are also returned by the vector database. Very simple. And those are called context, by the way. And you take those five context and you send it to an OpenAI chat completion API, which is a pretty much the large language model. And then you actually ask it to actually answer this user prompt based on the context that is it returned, and it actually generates a response. It's very simple, very elegant kind of a framework, and that's how most of the chatbot actually works. So let me give you an example. So if you look at this prompt, what is Document 360 and pricing plan? And this is the question, and that's the response, or this is the prompt basically. And these are the references, these are the article chunks for which the response, for which it is the content is used from these four articles to generate a response. Okay, so let's dive in. So the first line of this response comes from the second article, the second paragraph basically. Okay, and the second line comes from the first article, and again the article is written in a more of a unordered list, and the response is more on the it's a comma separated values. Okay, and the last line comes from the article number 3 and comes from the last paragraph. Actually, it's an unordered list, and that's how it actually produces a response. So these chunks from these three articles are stitched together in a very cohesive way, and then to generate a response for the question that you do. The very important thing for a tech writer to actually understand is it is generated. Let me repeat: it's a generated response, which means the chatbot will not use the exact words that you used to describe a particular phenomenon or how you actually written that piece of article. That's the nature of the LLM, the large language model. It's very probabilistic in nature. Even if you ask the same question 1,000 times, it will not use the exact words. The words will differ. Okay, so that is something you have to understand. That's the nature of the AI technology. Okay, let's, given that you understood how the RAG actually works in the chatbot, let's diving into how can I refactor the content, which is the essence of this webinar, in terms of how do you make sure you architect the existing content to be suitable for AI. The refact, there are a few principles as a tech writer you have to follow. The first thing is you need to have a good information architecture. You have to write the whole documentation in a way that a user or an AI chatbot find it easy to navigate. Very simple. The second aspect is you have to make sure the chatbot actually produces the right response to the prompts that you actually put in. Otherwise, you have to go back and see whether there's any kind of ambiguity in the content or what's constraining the chatbot in producing the response that you want it to be. Okay, the source of the truth basically. And then the content should have good quality. Okay, and I've talked to many tech traders, and when they say how good is your content quality, and then they say, oh, it's excellent, but then I usually doubt it. The reason is, the more the content actually grows, there are more chances the content might have some kind of an ambiguity present in there. You might not note it, and sometimes the human would not notice it, but for a chatbot it actually matters. Because if there is two pieces of information in your documentation article which are ambiguous, it's very hard for the chatbot to make the right call, okay, because it doesn't have any reference to the truth. So these are the three main principles. Let's dive into some kind of a tips I can actually share in terms of how you want to structure the content. The first and foremost thing is write detailed content. It might be counterintuitive. Why would I want to write a detailed content? The reason is the LLMs or text engine application. Remember, chatbot is more of a conversational type interface, which means if somebody comes and asks something about a step-by-step procedure, they'll say, how do I do this in your chatbot? But then they get curious and then they want to know what about a particular feature or why they built it. If you do not have that information in as part of your article, you actually missing out an opportunity to educate a customer on a particular piece of technology or a particular piece of definition, or maybe it's a product knowledge you're not able to give it to the customer. Okay, so it's better to write a detailed content. Ensure you have put a lot of information into it, because you have no idea about what kind of questions or the prompts you will anticipate. Okay, and I have tips to how do you actually anticipate as well. And then also put few FAQs, which is very counterintuitive for a tech writer. The moment I say FAQs, people say, look, it's a poor information design problem. No more FAQs, because why do I want to duplicate the content which is already present in my content in the existing documentation article? But the point I really want to make here is there are always nuances attached to a particular feature or some kind of a documentation. You might not cover it, add them as an FAQ at the end of the documentation. The reason is the FAQs are mostly act like a cheat sheets for chatbot, because it's all very conversational. The moment you put a question and an answer, the chatbot can actually ground the truth. Okay, that's very important. And most importantly, where do you actually source this FAQs from? Do not source it from the documentation article. Instead, source it from customer facing teams, your sales team, your marketing team, your customer support team. They are the sources for which you can actually construct an FAQ on a particular topic or a particular article. It's very important, and you have to keep updating them, because every time you have no idea what kind of questions that the customer. Over a period of time, you can also go and consolidate an FAQ and then put it as part of the content. That's fine, but have few FAQs part of your documentation, because more act like a cheat sheet for your RAG. Because I've already mentioned RAG works on semantic matching, and for you to pick the right kind of chunk, you have a Q&A. It's very likely that your text embedding of your user prompt and the particular chunk will have high kind of similarity and gets picked for generating a response. Okay. And the third aspect is use glossary terms consistently. And I have seen in a documentation site where they actually use these terms synonymously: stakeholder, user, client, customer, audience, all mean the same. And for someone who is very new to your product or documentation, when they read this term, it might have different meaning inside your product, but for them, they might think that it's all synonymous terms. Okay. And the third aspect, sorry, the fourth aspect is use of pronouns. Excuse me. So remember I was talking about chunking. Think about it. You don't repeat subject in your inside your paragraphs when they write, because that's what the pronouns for. Why do you want to repeat the subject? You just use a pronoun for it. But think about it. You start a big paragraph and then it starts with the subject, and then the second paragraph starts with a pronoun saying it something, because it refers to the previous paragraph and it knows what's the subject of that. Imagine where the chunking happens on the first paragraph and the second paragraph starts with it. The moment that context gets picked for some kind of a user prompt, it actually loses the context. So it's very important for a tech writer to know the chunking strategy. And then if you're starting a particular paragraph and you know that that's where it actually chunked, you have to repeat the subject. Okay. That's a very key factor to ensure that the context is not missed. Okay, and then the last point you probably know, bias-free inclusive language is universal. Again, I think I talked about this a lot in terms of the information architecture. You have to ensure that all these headings and subheadings do not have generic titles. Assume that, let's say, you are a multi-product company, or probably your software has different versions. Okay, you cannot have a generic title such as fee or pricing or how to do steps and stuff like that. Maybe you have to say a fee for this product or pricing for this software version. The moment you add, that actually adds context. Okay, sometimes in your information architecture it is might be on the top heading of your in terms of the grouping, but if it's further down, when you write an article, sometimes it's better to repeat that context, what you're actually referring to in the title itself. So whenever I write, ask tech writers to refactor the content, I usually say, go and refactor a lot of this headings, titles basically, okay, and the subheadings as well. I have seen in my experience where people do this lift and shift. Basically, they have some kind of a big PDF, and they actually bring it to the documentation, and they want to put the chatbot on the top of it. It doesn't work, okay, because it needs context to actually understand a particular heading and what it's actually talking about. Okay, that's very important. And make sure your content does not have any kind of ambiguity. Okay, sometimes I've seen articles saying pricing is 99, and in some other article it will say $400. Okay, again, people sometimes miss out updating some information. Again, I don't know how big your documentation is, but these things essentially matters. Oh, tables is my favorite. Again, if you look at that table, what I've actually given you, and if I ask you a question, is Markdown support? Is does Markdown supports code blocks? What would you say? Some people say yes. Some people will say no. But the problem is the symbol cross is used as tick here. Okay, it's very confusing for even for a human. Okay, so you got to understand how these symbols, especially, are being decoded into the chunking strategy. Okay, again, talk to the vendors or talk to the developers who actually build the chatbot and try to understand how these cross or tick symbols or any kind of fonts that you have or any kind of other symbols you have are being pre-processed as well. No more null values. Ensure that it's all complete. Your full table is complete, because you never know what kind of question that your customer is going to ask for which the answer lies in the table. If the information is not present, the chatbot is going to say, I do not know. Okay. It's better to put binary. I would want everybody to say yes, no, or not available, or not applicable, and things like that inside the table. So it's very intuitive. Even if it's not, that's okay. Put a legend under the table saying a tick means yes, cross means no. So it's easy for the chatbot when it actually produces a response to actually understand that context. Okay. Again, if you're a big fan of Markdown, go for this ABBR tag. Okay, that then you abbreviate all the acronyms that is mentioned inside the table. Again, when you write code snippets, again, when you're refactoring the code for AI, make sure that you have some kind of a description about the code, and more importantly, put some comments on what this code is all about, and specify a programming language, because sometimes you write a piece of code in Python, but then the user prompt might be, hey, generate how to do that in Go language. So basically your LLM has capability to take a particular piece of code and able to convert into another language. Okay, it can completely capable of doing that, but to do that you need context. The more information you provide in your documentation about the code, it can better understand and then translate that piece of code into another language. Metadata, again, it's based on how you actually implement your chatbot. What I've actually given you in terms of the framework is a very high level framework, but there are sophisticated RAG technologies where basically they do hybrid search, and they do a lot of things called re-ranking. Excuse me. For that, you need to, as a tech writer, you have to supply a lot of metadata. This includes time information about a particular article, an author, maybe some version numbers, maybe some information about the metadata attached to the content itself. For example, for images, you can actually add alt text. For some of the articles that you have written, maybe you can also send SEO, meta description, things like that. Okay. So I want to cover some of the learnings we had with some of the interactions with talking to our own customers. So I'll give you an example. This is one of the article that was written. This was very old content. This was using a very old LLM model, GPT 3.5. And what they actually written is that they have written a piece of content on a step-by-step procedure, and it's about 8 minute read, and it has 22 steps in it. Okay, what happened was when they actually put in the same kind of a question into the user prompt, the output only gave 15 steps instead of 22. What actually happened was it was actually split into three chunks. That's not a problem. We still keep the metadata associated with this. The LLM truncated the output because the output token limit exceeded the LLM's capability to put the token. Again, it's a limitation of the large language model. Right now, it is not. Right now, the context window for a big large language model is about 1 million if you're using OpenAI, and that's good enough. But this actually happened in one of those old large language model. So we actually advise the customers to change refactor the content such that it actually gets into one chunk. So they refactor the content, they reduced, or they basically combined some of the steps into one, and then they actually reduced from 8 minutes to 5 minutes read with call steps, and then it was one chunk, and the LM was able to fit it into the context window for its output. So this is one of the good scenarios. The other aspect is definitions. Sometimes people put all the definition into one article. Basically, it's a catalog for all the definition. These are particularly not great. The reason is, remember I was talking about chunking. If you have one big article that has all the definitions, you might not know that whether it's going to be chunked appropriately. Okay, and the right embeddings are created. Basically, if you want to create a better business glossary, define the term where you actually introduced, or maybe have this definition as part of your catalog. That's fine, but you have to define the term where it's actually introduced, so it's very contextual in terms of your content. Okay, it's very important. Again, I think I've talked about this. Yeah, the FAQs again. With the FAQs, don't put all the FAQs for all the article into one piece of article. Let's say you have 100 articles. You can't take FAQ of each article and then put it into one single article. Not going to work. You can have FAQs of the similar article at the end of the article. That's fine. That's usually what I recommend, because usually people do not go to the bottom of the screen and then read it. Basically, you can have it as a bot content. Okay. The other aspect is you can create each FAQ article for each article as well. That's also fine. The most important thing is it has to be contextual. Anything related to a particular topic has to be put under one article or under one FAQ theme. Basically, I think I mentioned FAQs are more like a cheat sheet for your chatbot. Acronyms are very important. Make sure you define them, and then if you have acronyms into different language, again that's a very different paradigm. The translation management also come into play, so make sure you include the definition of acronyms as well. Okay, in the definition. Look, again, I think I talked about this avoid generic title. When you say inviting a new user, make sure you're saying inviting a new user for Document 360, inviting a new user for Turbo 360. A Document 360 and Turbo 360 could be two different products from your company. Okay, so avoid generic title. That's usually the messaging. Yeah, look, this is one of the examples that we have learned. Sometimes the chatbots are not time aware. When I say what's the latest software version, it might fumble, it might not return. Again, there are techniques to fix that, but a lot of chatbots they use a RAG approach. They might not be able to answer that. Okay, just to be aware, there are a few techniques to address that as well. Again, avoid using these time-centric keywords like new, latest, and stuff like that, because it's very hard for RAG model to be very time aware. Okay, unless there is architectural changes made to your chatbot. Avoid duplicate titles. Again, it's also very confusing for a human. Again, you can actually see this is one of our old articles you have written, a same title but one for Make and one for Zapier. Okay, again, it's very confusing for an AI chatbot to understand unless you didn't have the context. This is a very good example for providing context. This is one of the article where they actually put in something and they actually put some kind of a context about this. Yeah. Okay, I've talked about a lot of techniques to refactor the content, some of the principles behind that. Let's look at the evaluation process. Before you take chatbot live, what are the things as a tech writer you have to do? The first aspect is take your knowledge base, understand how it's been pre-processed and things like that. Then you have to do test cases. Okay. And I will talk about in the next slide in terms of what those test cases are. Basically, you have to prepare questions and you have to write a ground truth for each of those questions by yourself. And then take it to your chatbot, the same question, and then get a response from the chatbot. And then you compare the ground truth with the generated response. And then calculate some kind of a metric on accuracy, context, content retrieval, and things like that. And there are frameworks out there which are free to use. One of my favorite one is OpenAI Evals framework, and there is RAGAS and Simple Q. And again, these are completely open source, and you can actually put it to test. And then you measure accuracy. How accurate the generated response with my ground truth. And based on your risk appetite, let me repeat, based on the risk appetite of your organization, you can actually take your chatbot live or not. And then basically you get the feedback from your customers if they dislike some of the things that can be used to fine tune some of your content or maybe make tweaks to the chatbot underlying framework as well. This is usually my go-to live checklist if you want to take any chatbot live. The first most important thing is you have to prepare 100 questions or basically prompts with ground answers. And I have a rule of thumb in terms of how you prepare those 100 questions. Prepare 25 what type questions. Basically, these are definitions or explanation about some of the concept that you have. That's 25. And take 25 step by step or a procedural kind of a question. Hey, how do I do this? How do I add article? How do I add user? Those type of question. And then take 20 questions which are very tricky for a human to actually find. Now, when I say tricky, this is where you have to find information from different article and stitch together to find take a response. And those are tricky questions. Talk to a subject matter expert because they know this kind of questions from their heart. 20 could be a simple yes or no question. Okay, is this available? Is this not? It's very binary. So your chatbot can actually produce a binary response. And 10 questions where which you do not have an answer in your knowledge base. You have the ground truth. Take all these 10, 100 questions, put it through your chatbot, generate a response, and then you compare. Okay, compare accuracy, compare your content retrieval, compare most importantly whether the right chunks are picked to generate a response and things like that. And you can compare, you can compute some of those metrics. For example, you can compute accuracy, faithfulness, truth, and things like that from all these frameworks. And then based on that, you can actually evaluate whether you want to take your chatbot live. So in terms of some high level summary in terms of refactoring your content, make sure your table is complete and you have short tables. Again, you can't have 10,000 rows and millions of columns in your documentation and ask the AI to actually answer, produce a response from. Not going to happen. The table have to be short. Make sure there are column headings and row headings, especially when you put tables. Have contextual heading and have a good content structure. Again, it comes to that principle of having good information architecture. Write it in a simple second person singular. You probably already know that. When it comes to pronouns, especially work on where your article is going to get chunked. And if the new paragraph is starting with the pronoun, make sure that you replace the pronouns with the subject. Okay. Use consistent vocabulary across your article. Make sure there's no ambiguous information present across your article. Produce detailed content. And there you go. Those are high level kind of principles. That's pretty much what I have right now. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Selva. The session was quite insightful, and I'm sure the audience will agree with me. A huge thanks to you for walking us through the topic. I hope the insights shared today gave everyone a clearer understanding of how to make your documentation AI ready while maintaining clarity for human readers. And of course, if you have more questions or want to learn more about Document 360, then feel free to reach out. We'll be back soon with another session.